Hi, this is Dr. Hoefferle again for our lecture covering the Holocaust and World War II. So, the Holocaust and World War II are heavily studied in many different history classes, and for many of you, these might have been your favorite topics to study in history. They have so many lessons for us. I think that's one of the reasons why so many people like to study them, because they really shape the modern day world in thinking about human rights and war. They have so many rich lessons for us to learn. So the first question that I had for you were, what are the causes and effects of genocide? So we're trying to learn from history to understand genocides that have happened in your and my lifetime. So you wouldn't have remembered the Cambodia genocide of 1973, and probably not Rwanda or Bosnia in 1994 1995, but maybe you remembered the Darfur genocide in 2005. Genocides have been going on since the Holocaust, and they happened before the Holocaust too. So we're just going to look at the Holocaust that happened in the 1930s and 1940s against Jewish people in Germany as a case study. So we're trying to understand what are some of the causes of Holocaust so we can figure out how to prevent them from happening again. And then we want to know what are some of the long-term effects of genocides like the Holocaust. All right, so let's move on to look at the causes of genocide. In most cases, genocides today, as well as in the Holocaust itself, are caused by a lot of intolerance. So it means intolerance of difference. So you think that people are different from yourself and therefore not as good as yourself, that they're somehow evil or subhuman, or you're able to label them as an enemy, somebody who's worthy of death alone. So those are the kind of attitudes that are necessary for one group of people to totally annihilate, to kill off men, women, and children of another group of people. Something that to us seems horrific today. It's tough to understand, but you can readily see racism and religious intolerance, prejudice, greed, political manipulation in our society today. It's in the world today. And when those things come together and are manipulated by politicians, it's not so difficult for a genocide to take place. So racism can very often lead to racial violence. Religious intolerance can lead to religious violence and genocide, and ethnic prejudice and the desire to take what your neighbor has, that greed urge. And then politicians trying to use racism in order to gain some sort of political power. All those things can lead to a genocide. But in order for those things to lead to a genocide, the majority of people have to be indifferent. So you got to convince the majority of people that it's not their business, that it doesn't matter to them if somebody else halfway around the world is murdered, that you shouldn't have to care about your neighbor. Let them take care of yourself. So that kind of emotional indifference to violence being perpetrated against other people is also needed, because if the world cared, then it wouldn't let one group of people commit a genocide against another. So indifference, I think, is another recipe for genocide. In the early part of the 20th century, another movement called racial purity, or the eugenics movement, or scientific racism, was also a leading cause of genocide because it had a solution. So if you were racist and you said, okay, well, my race of people is better than every other race of people in the world, and I want to keep my race pure. I don't want anybody in my race to have sex with a member of another race. So in order to keep my race pure and keep my race on top, we need to eliminate the inferior races of people. And that's eugenics. That's using science to try to prohibit the birth of genetically inferior people, whether you can think of them as racially genetically inferior, or maybe you think that homosexuals are genetically inferior, or maybe you think that disabled people are genetically inferior, and bring down your race. You try to eliminate those people from procreating, and so therefore you purify your race so that the dominant race can succeed in taking over the world. So that theory was around beginning in the 1800s, and it really intensified in popularity in the beginning of the 20th century. Another cause of the Holocaust in particular that happens in the 1930s was an ancient form of anti-Semitism that dated all the way back to the beginning of Christianity. Now, as many people realize, Jesus Christ was a Jew, and his followers were Jewish first, and then they became Christian when they followed Jesus as the Christ. Within the first couple hundred years, though, a split happened between the Christian Jewish people and the Jewish people. The Jewish people born Jewish who stayed Jewish, and the Jewish people born Jewish but who became Christian. A split happened between them, a religious split. And over time, the Christian people, the people who converted to Christianity, were born Christian, came to see Jewish people, or Semites, as evil, as Christ killers, as the cause of the problems of the world, as the reason why God might punish a community, because we allow Jews to stay in our community. So Christians in Europe and America began to develop a whole theory of hatred towards Jews, which is called anti-Semitism. So a whole theory that Jews are the problem, that Jews are the source of evil in the world. So by the Middle Ages, this anti-Jewish feeling had begun to result in violence against Jews that we call pogroms. So since the Middle Ages, Christians have been murdering Jewish people, and we have much evidence of this. Some Christians even put pictures of it in their Bibles. They didn't see a problem with it. They really firmly believed that Jewish people were evil. So you can see the beginning of anti-Semitism in Christian European and then Christian American culture already in the Middle Ages, and then it just intensified over the years. In the 1800s, it resulted in many Jewish deaths as well. In Germany, the Nazi Party, and especially Adolf Hitler, brought together all these causes of genocide. They brought together that scientific racism and the seedbed of Christian anti-Semitism, and racism and prejudice and greed were all manipulated by the Nazi politicians. And using their propaganda machine, they began to try to blame all of Germany's problems on Jewish people. And the solution was to eliminate the Jewish threat from the world. Essentially, to somehow eliminate all Jews. So once Adolf Hitler was made the Führer, and he was able to make the laws of Germany, he passed a law in 1935 called the Nuremberg Laws. So these were a series of laws that were directed against Jewish people, but others as well, banning all kinds of behavior. So for example, the Nuremberg Laws banned intermarriage between Jewish people and Christians. They made it illegal to be homosexual. They made it illegal to be communist. They required Jewish people to live in certain areas called ghettos. They banned Jewish people from practicing law or practicing medicine. They fired Jewish people from the universities and from the schools and from government positions. They took away Jewish people's voting rights. They made Jewish people no longer citizens of Germany. So you see, law by law, they made Jewish people an oppressed minority, totally controlled within the German society. And in addition to that, the Nazi Party had a propaganda machine designed to try to purify the German race. You can see the poster in the middle here is a German poster, a Nazi poster, glorifying the German family, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, Aryan race that they felt were the dominant race, the Germanic race, and they wanted to make sure that these families had lots of babies, so they encouraged German women to have lots of babies, and they encouraged these families, again, to look out for the Jew, to identify the Jew, to isolate the Jew, and to make sure that Jewish people no longer had any power in their society, to fight Jewish domination of the world. In the lower picture here, that's a Nazi propaganda poster that's pointing the finger at a caricature of a Jewish banker. So they're blaming the Great Depression on a Jewish banker here. And they're saying to that Jewish person who's forced to wear the Star of David, no more. We take away your wealth, we're going to take away your job and your property, and we're going to force you to live in a ghetto where you belong. So in this way, they demonize Jewish people, making it easier for more German Christians to say, oh, I don't need to pay attention to them. I can be indifferent to their suffering. They deserve it. They're criminals. They're the bad guys. It's okay to beat up on the bad guys. It's okay to take away their rights because they deserve it. So in that way, you can see how a religious or a political party and a politician can bring together these hatreds, these fears, greed, and long-standing racism and begin to cause a genocide. So if we want to prevent a genocide, we need to identify when we see that racism happening. When somebody paints a swastika on a Jewish headstone or on a Jewish synagogue or burns down a Jewish synagogue, as has happened in the United States repeatedly, we need to criticize that. We need to publicize that and say that this is wrong. We are not going as a society to be indifferent to this, and we are going to arrest anybody who's attacking Jewish people in our midst, or any other religious minority, or any other racial group. That we will not stand by and let another genocide happen on our watch. So these are the things that we need to be aware of to prevent genocide from happening in the future. History can teach us some powerful lessons. Now, many of you might still be convinced it's not your job. It's not your responsibility to prevent a genocide. You're powerless. You didn't kill anybody. You just didn't do anything about somebody killing another group of people. Why should you care? Well, let's look at why you should care. Let's look at the effects of a genocide. So with the Holocaust, we have well-documented effects of genocide. So in the Holocaust, we can see that millions of people can lose their lives. In the Holocaust, between the 1930s and the 1940s, 6 million Jewish people died. In addition to that, another 5 to 10 million Slavs, communists, religious minorities, Romani, which are gypsies, homosexuals, and disabled people also lost their lives. All of these people are the people that the Nazis identified as outcasts and inferior people that deserved to die. So millions of people lost their lives in horrific ways. When we look at some of the eyewitness accounts of the Holocaust, you get a sense of the scope of this horrific event in world history. If you want to pause and grab your Pomerantz book, turn to page 312 of your Pomerantz book. Remember, you want to use primary sources for any essay question, and this is the excellent one for the Holocaust. This is written by a woman, a Jewish woman, who was in a concentration camp. So the map over here shows you the different concentration camps where the criminals of the Nazi regime were imprisoned. And you can see all these dozens and dozens of concentration camps. The black labeled ones like Auschwitz and Treblinka, these were the extermination camps. So extermination means people went there to be gassed and killed. In the rest of them, places like Buchenwald, which I visited, and Dachau, which I also visited, and then Bergen-Belsen, where this was up in the Netherlands, that Bergen-Belsen was located, where the primary source was written. These ones were work camps. So this is where people went to be worked to death. They were slavery camps. All the enemies of the Nazi state, including the prisoners of war, like Russian soldiers and American soldiers, they're put in these concentration camps to work for the Nazi state for free. So this is a woman, Hannah Levi Haas, and she's Jewish. She was in that concentration camp for several years, and she kept a secret diary while she was there on what little piece of paper she could gather together. So as you look at it, there are some things that should stand out, and these are things that you probably know already. Like, for example, the starvation that they faced. They were hungry, they were not fed enough. They turned against each other and stole from each other, as human beings would probably be inclined to do. When you're starving and your child is starving, you're going to do what it takes to survive. You can see these men here, and after the concentration camps were liberated, these are some of the survivors. They were skin and bones. They're starving to death. She talks about the terror of how they were kept from resisting. in these concentration camps, how the Germans controlled them through terror, how they were forced to get up every morning before dawn at 4 in the morning and stand for hours in the freezing cold, many of them without even shoes, no jackets in the winter, standing for at least 2 hours, waiting for the officer in charge to count them, beat on them, yell at them, yell insults on them. They're starving, they're weak, people collapse. This is every day. On page 215, they talk about the brutality and the sadism of the prison commander and the prison guards. They say the guards are nothing but criminals that love to beat on and hurt other people. And they took a perverse joy, these German, Polish, and French prison guards. Tens of thousands of Europeans, Christians, participated in this horrific Holocaust perpetrated against Jewish people. Right? So these are people like you and me that turn into sadistic monsters against their fellow human beings. Many of them beat up the Jewish prisoners until they're broken and bloody and swollen. They strike women, it's on page 316. They beat up women too, or worse yet, succeed in prostituting them, raping them. So you can see some of these awful experiences again and again. She even talks to a person from Auschwitz who says that they actually have food because so many people there are just being murdered. They aren't even working them to death. They're fed, the people who survive are fed so that they can feed the rest of their murdered fellows into the crematoriums where they're burned and turned into dust. So you can get a sense of the anger she feels, of the inhumanity of this. She even says, I'm terribly ashamed to have lived through this. That just even as a survivor, she has a survivor guilt of seeing so many millions die. And while she's experiencing, she says, allowing your body and soul to putrefy and wallow in your own filth, suffering from total starvation, devoured by pus and stench, where people who are alive are rotting to death from epidemic diseases and starvation. This is a nightmare. It's awful to read. You can see some of the films that were taken by the Allies as they liberated the concentration camps. This is a photo from one of those liberations. Those are dead bodies. Those are people's legs. All their clothes have been stripped off of them, dehumanizing them even further. They're nothing but bones. This is the end result of genocide. Who would want that on their conscience? How do you live with that? Either as a survivor of it, a victim, or as somebody who perpetrated that. Germany has been dealing with that ever since. And it's really struggled with it, with its legacy of being monsters towards other people. Germany and the Nazi Party are going to be seen as real evil people, as real demons. But others participated in that genocide too. You know, like I said, some of the causes of genocide are indifference. The United States was indifferent. Did we go in there to try to save them? No. When Jewish victims were fleeing the Nazi Holocaust, did we welcome them in? No. We turned their boats back to Germany. We were anti-Semitic too. You see, so we bear some of that guilt. The British had a strong Nazi party. They were strongly anti-Semitic. They didn't want the Jewish people either. French people turned in their Jewish neighbors, knowing what would happen to them. Poles turned in their Jewish neighbors. Russians turned in their Jewish neighbors. Yugoslavians, Croatians turned in their Jewish neighbors. Italians, you know, Life is Beautiful. Remember that film that came out? It's about Italians doing this. It's not just the Nazis. Yes, the Nazis were evil. This was evil. But the whole world was guilty of it. The whole world stood by. And we all bear that guilt and that shame for that. Those are the effects, and that's the reason why we want to stop it from ever happening again. Now, the Second World War is another one of those horrific events in world history that we would want to stop from ever happening again. We do not want to have a Third World War. And we haven't had a Third World War. Historians have been hard at work trying to learn the lessons of the Second World War to prevent another world war from happening. We're working hard, still today in the 21st century, trying to remind politicians, oh, be on the on the lookout for this happening. Don't let that happen. Be careful that this doesn't happen, right? So we want to learn about how that war was caused, what happened during that war, so we can kind of prevent another war from becoming. We've had many wars since the Second World War, but never a world war. And we hope in the 21st century we will not have a third world war. So let's try to learn some of these lessons of World War II. Causes of war. We know that expansionism, this desire to control other countries, is a cause of war. In particular, German and Japanese expansion really caused World War II. Italy was an expansionistic too, but it wasn't very successful at its expansion. Germany and Japan were very powerful and very successful at expansion, and that's why they're the causes of World War II rather than Italy. They're the ones who really succeeded at conquering other people. Of course, that causes war. It always has and it always will. Be on the lookout for people like Adolf Hitler, people who get a big following, who get control of a military, who write out their plans ahead of time to conquer and cause war around the world, to target people like Jews and blame them for their problems. Mein Kampf was a blueprint for World War II, written in 1925. If people had taken him seriously and thought very carefully about who he was and what his goals were, and stopped him by any means, things might have happened very differently. The Japanese also had a number of warning signs. A lot of their literature talked about how the Japanese race was dominant and how they were destined to dominate the world and dominate Asia. We could have paid attention to what was going on in other countries. We could have read the news. We could have learned foreign languages and read what they were saying, so we knew them better and we knew what they were up to. But the United States was isolationist in the 1930s. We were so worried about our own problems that we didn't care about anybody else's problems. We didn't think about the rest of the world. We didn't take world history classes. We didn't take an international relations class. We had no idea about global politics. And because we were ignorant, we let this war happen under our noses. Why do you have to take a world history class at Wingate? World War II is why. Now, the actual start of the war happened in September of 1939. It was actually started by both the Soviet Union and Germany. So the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact that was signed just before the war started was an agreement between Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler, two mortal enemies. They hated each other, but they agreed that they would both invade Poland and then they would divide it right down the middle. So they were going to start this war together because they both wanted Poland. Both of them were angry with the Versailles Peace Treaty that created Poland out of their territory. So this non-aggression pact was a result of World War I, a result of the Versailles Peace Treaty. So this is one way that the Versailles Peace Treaty was a cause of World War II. World War I punished Germany, led to the rise of Adolf Hitler. World War I took away territory from Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union and created new countries out of it, and they wanted it back. So you see how World War I is shown in the Soviet Nazi aggression pact, non-aggression pact. World War I was definitely a cause of World War II. All right. Now I want to move on to looking at the course of the war and the strategies of the war. So this map, and you have a map in your book that's similar to this one, just shows you the direction of the troop movements and the offenses. Now if you really love military history, there are many great films that you can watch that actually fairly closely follow the battles in Europe, at least, of the war. Now the battles of World War II started in Germany. So Germany invades Poland and the Soviet Union invades Poland. And then Italy is going to help out Germany. They're both going to invade North Africa and try to take away the British and the French dominions in North Africa and get control of the oil fields. Germany is going to use a blitzkrieg strategy to invade Western Europe very quickly, conquering France, Belgium, the Netherlands. So they're going to control most of Europe, most of the central of Europe very, very quickly. Eventually, they're going to conquer Norway and Finland. Sweden is going to remain neutral. Ireland will remain neutral. Switzerland is neutral. Portugal and Spain are neutral. Turkey is neutral. The rest are engaged and involved in the war in one way or another. So in the beginning, Adolf Hitler's forces and his allies are going to be winning. So soon after Poland is divided, Germany signs an Axis agreement with Italy and Japan. So they sign this agreement that if any one of them is attacked, then they will declare war. So they're going to be one side, the Axis powers, and they're going to be very successful. Germany is going to use its blitzkrieg strategy by massing an overwhelming military force to invade and quickly conquer nations very, very quickly before they can mount a defense. Partly these Axis victories are also going to be due to the fact that the United States stays out of the war. Again, we're isolationists. We don't want to get involved. We want to continue to trade with all the combatant nations, and we still want to make money off of it. So we start lending and leasing some of our military weapons to the British, getting us involved. We don't like Japan taking over European colonies in China, and so we place an embargo on Japan, a trade embargo on them, to try to convince them to continue to allow the United States to have free trade. It angers Japan, and it eventually provokes Japan into declaring war and bombing our military base at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Now, Americans at that time perceived that attack as an unprovoked attack, an illegal act of war against the United States. But we had frozen Japanese assets already in the United States before that. Japan threatened us after we put a trade embargo on them. There were many warning signs that they were going to attack one of our military bases. Pearl Harbor was the most logical military base to attack. It was the biggest port in the Pacific Ocean. So I think what Japan was on Japan's mind was they were thinking the United States was going to attack them, so they saw this was a preemptive attack, that they would attack our Navy right away to kind of cripple the United States so that the United States wouldn't be a threat to them anymore. So in their eyes, they didn't see it as an unprovoked attack. They thought it was a provoked attack and an act of self-defense to bomb that military base in Pearl Harbor. Of course, once that was bombed, we lost about 5,000 lives on that day. And then we declared war on Japan. And once we declared war on Japan, because of the Axis alliance, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. And then we were fully involved after that point. Then the United States joined the British and became an ally of the British. Once the Germans switched sides and attacked the Russians joined in on the Allied side. So it was Russia, Britain, and the United States joining together. Russia tried to push Germany back from the east, on the Eastern Front. The United States and Britain tried to start fighting Germany first in Africa. So they attacked first through North Africa, trying to get up to attack Italy and Germany through the south. On the Pacific Front, the United States fought alone pretty much. The British were so involved in trying to defend just themselves from German bombings that they could not send any help over to the Pacific Front. So the Pacific was largely fought between the Japanese and the Americans. From the Pacific campaign, we have a really good eyewitness account of that Pacific campaign in your Pomerantz book. If you want to pause and go get your Pomerantz book, once you have your Pomerantz book, turn to the required reading for today. That starts on page 319. This is written by an American Marine, a soldier born in Alabama. His name is E.B. Sledge, and he's talking about a battle that took place on Okinawa. So this is a campaign. This was written after the war in his memoir, and there are hundreds of sources like this of soldiers from all sides writing their memoirs of what happened to them in the war. From all those memoirs, we get documentary films, and we can also get some of the more Hollywood films like Band of Brothers that are recreations based on those memoirs and the diaries of the soldiers. So there's a lot, and I really like Band of Brothers. I bring that up because I think that that's one of the really good kind of soldier's perspective of World War II, what it was really like to be a soldier in World War II. So in this excerpt that you have here, he's talking about what it was like to be in the Battle of Okinawa. As you skim through it, you want to look for, you're thinking about how do soldiers experience war, and you want to think about what are the effects of this war on this soldier. Right? So we're looking at, if we want to avoid war, why do we want to avoid war? So many of you guys might love playing video games where you play a soldier in a war, where you're mowing down people with your machine gun. You might love murdering people in a video game, and you might think that being a soldier in a war is actually really cool. And you might think that war isn't so bad. So I think for many of us who are not soldiers, and we only experience soldiers through fake things like video games and movies, we can be misled into thinking that war is cool and that war is fun, that killing is cool. Sledge and other memoirs like this are really an important reality check for us. What it's really like. So what is it really like? What are the things you underlined in this excerpt? Is this battle cool? Is he having a good time? Is he talking about mowing people down with his machine gun? What's he doing in this battle? The things that I underlined were on page 320. The battlefield was a horrible scene. It was a scene of terrible nightmares. Sleep was almost impossible. They have to sleep sitting up or crouching down in a foxhole in the mud and cold rain. They're not sleeping in some bed in a tent. They're out on the battlefield. There's no provisions here. It's all been bombed out. It's a muddy mess. There's no vegetation at all here. This is not some beautiful Pacific island. It's been bombed into a bloody pulp. And he says on page 321, it's covered with corpses. He's sleeping amongst corpses. And at night he has these nightmares, imagining the dead rising like ghosts. They're asking him for help in his nightmares. Among all the craters, he says, there's a scattering of marine corpses. These were his friends. These are his buddies. And they're dead. And he's sleeping next to them as they're rotting. And he talks about, on page 322, he describes one particular corpse in depth. Exactly how he looked. It's burned into his memory. Every time he closes his eyes, he sees those corpses. I think that there's a really interesting quote that he has on page 322 in the middle paragraph that starts, every time I looked over the edge of the foxhole. He's talking about the corpse he sees there, and he says, maybe he was mocking the folly of the war itself. Quote, I am the harvest of man's stupidity. I am the fruit of the Holocaust. I prayed like you to survive, but look at me now. It is over for us who are dead, but you must struggle and will carry the memories all your life. People back home will wonder why you can't forget. And that's exactly what he's going through. He's writing this as a memoir, remember. The war is over already by the time he wrote this down. So as he's remembering this, he can't sleep at night anymore after the war. He's got nightmares. He can't forget. And the people back home have no idea what he's seen and what he's gone through. So the war doesn't end for veterans just because a peace treaty is signed. It didn't end in World War II or World War I. Those veterans came home disabled with mental problems and psychological problems and horrific nightmares that they face the rest of their lives. It's the same thing for our Iraq War veterans today and our veterans of the Afghanistan War. They are the homeless amongst us. They're unemployed. They're suffering from all kinds of psychological problems. This is a legacy of war. It's not cool. it's foolish, and it's horrific. Those are the legacies of war. If you look at what soldiers actually wrote and what they actually experienced. Now, the D-Day invasion had a horrific death toll, but it was the turning point of the war. It was the point in the war where the United States and the British and the Russians were able to finally push back the Germans and start making substantial gains towards victory over the German forces. So D-Day was the invasion from Britain into Normandy, France, that was occupied by the Germans. The photograph in the lower right here is showing an actual photograph from that. Saving Private Ryan covers that pretty well. We've got a lot of documentary films that cover that really well as well. So within a year after D-Day, the British and American forces had forced the Germans to surrender. The Russian forces were already in Germany at that point as well. Hitler fought until Berlin was surrounded by the Russians. He didn't want to give up, so he killed his wife first, and then he shot himself. And then his cronies burned his body so it couldn't be paraded around by the Russians. Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day, was celebrated on May 8th when Germany unconditionally surrendered. But the war didn't end there for the Pacific. The Pacific War continued on for another 4 months until August in 1945. The Japanese continued to fight on. The Americans continued to fight in that war, having really high casualty rates until the Americans finally dropped the nuclear bombs, their new weapons, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the beginning of August of 1945, and forced the Japanese Emperor Hirohito to surrender. And then that finally ended World War II. So in the effects of the war, obviously all wars involve death and destruction. That's just normal. World wars involve massive death and destruction. So just in terms of death tolls, take a look in your Tigner book now, page 748 to 749. That's giving you an effect of World War II. These are the casualties from World War II. Take a look at it. Look at the estimated total death column on the right, far right. It's on page 748, 749 of Tigner. Total deaths. Which country suffered the most in World War II in terms of deaths? Which country suffered the most? Did you say USSR? It's the USSR. 27 million citizens of the Soviet Union died. Many people, when we look at our Hollywood films, they don't even show the Russians. They actually suffered the most from World War II. Keep looking for who suffered the next highest death rates. China. Again, in our films, we totally ignore the Chinese suffering. 10 million Chinese people died in World War II. Look down a little bit further now. So we normally see in our films of World War II, we see the deaths and the costs from maybe the British perspective, the American perspective, and possibly the German perspective. Look at how many died from the UK. Only 357,000. I mean, that's a lot, but nothing compared to the Chinese and the Soviet Union. Look at the United States. 298,000? Please. It's nothing compared to what the Chinese and the Soviet Union suffered. If you look at what Germany suffered in the war, I'm just going down and I'm looking for the Germany here. Okay, that's on the second page. 4.2 million. That's a lot. Yeah, that's a lot. But if you just go up a little bit more, you're going to see that 5.8 million Polish people died. Did you ever see the Polish perspective of World War II? More of them died than Germans did. So you can see there's a lot of people involved in World War II that are on here. Like, look at Indonesia. They were occupied by the Japanese. 4 million Indonesians died in World War II. Do you ever see their perspective in all of our movies? We're so American-centric. It's like it's our war. It wasn't our war. It was a world war, and other countries suffered much, much more than we did. In fact, World War II is one of the reasons why the United States is the #1 world power today. We didn't suffer like other places suffered. It's the only reason why the United States came out way ahead of China. It's taken China, ever since World War II to recover from World War II. So the effect of the war, all that death and destruction for some people, but not for the United States. For us in the United States, we have a positive outcome of World War II. We invent nuclear weapons. We get the beginning of that technology from Germany. Nazi scientists were experimenting with nuclear power, and it was Albert Einstein who brought those notes to the United States and helped us out to develop nuclear weapons first, so we could use them against Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's going to help make us the #1 world power, the first world that your book talks about. So the U.S. comes out ahead. We're virtually unscathed by World War II. We come out more powerful, more wealthy, and we're able to dominate the world following World War II. It switches from being a European-dominated world to an American-dominated world after World War II. Now, another sort of positive outcome of World War II is that we came to the realization that it's not okay for a soldier in war to commit atrocities against civilian populations. So in the Nuremberg war crimes trials that took place in Nuremberg, Germany in the decade following World War II, we put on trial Nazis, Japanese, and Italians who committed atrocities against civilians, who mass murdered Jewish people, who mass murdered political criminals, who mass murdered prisoners of war. We held them accountable for what they did in war. No, their justification was, I was just following orders. That's what soldiers have a right to do. And in the Nuremberg war crimes trials, the world established that even if you're a soldier and even if you're following orders, you cannot commit atrocities against civilians. Otherwise, you'll be held accountable. So in that way, it's a protection of human rights that comes about as a result of the atrocities of World War II. Another kind of mixed effect of World War II was towards the end of the war. The British and the American governments got together and signed an agreement called the Bretton Woods Agreement. And this was an agreement to stabilize the world economy and to make the United States the basic monetary fund for the world, that we would set the economic foundation for the world instead of Britain. So it's going to shift power, economic power, away from Europe again towards the United States. It's also going to create the World Bank. So the World Bank is going to be a group of big private bankers who get together and they're going to set kind of economic policies for the world's banking institutions. Right? So the World Bank is going to be kind of a check against global economic fluctuations that led to the Great Depression and World War II. So they're trying to prevent another war by stabilizing the economy. This agreement is also going to create the International Monetary Fund, and that's going to set monetary policies for the world's economy, exchange rates and monetary policies. The overwhelming control of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, though, are going to be Britain and the United States who created it. Later on, they're going to bring in Germany and France and their other allies. But they are really going to stabilize the global economy, but in their favor. So this, again, is going to set up the United States in the aftermath of the war to be the superpower. The big power, the #1 power of the world following World War II. In the Yalta Conference, you see the photograph from 1945 here. This is the last photograph taken of Franklin Roosevelt. He died shortly after this. In the Yalta Conference, the big three, Churchill, FDR, and Stalin met to decide on what the post-war world was going to look like. And so they're going to decide there the effects of the post-war world. And as your book talks about in the introduction to this chapter, it talked about how FDR imagined a world with international states and the peace being kept by a United Nations, and the dismantling of empires and expansionistic policies. Churchill wanted to keep the British Empire, and Stalin wanted to extend control over Eastern Europe to protect himself from Germany. So they had differing goals for this conference. In the end, they did agree to create a United Nations. And this is taking the idea of a League of Nations but giving it more power. The United Nations would be housed in New York City, and the United Nations would mediate between conflicts between nations, but it would also have a peacekeeping force, so its own army, in case one country was committing crimes against another country. So that's going to be today a very powerful force in the world. Maybe not as powerful as they had hoped for. It hasn't prevented wars, but it has helped to prevent a third world war. At the conference, they all signed off on a Declaration of Liberated Peoples, and basically all the nations liberated from the Italians, Germans, and the Japanese would be occupied by the people who liberated them until they could hold elections. So it basically said that all of the liberated peoples, liberated from Axis control, would have an election and have a right to determine their own government, but that they would be occupied by their liberators until that time. So, for example, the Soviet Union liberated most of Eastern Europe and Eastern Germany, and so they occupied that area through the 1950s. The Soviet Union liberated North Korea, so they occupied North Korea through the 1950s. The United States liberated South Korea, so we occupied South Korea. We liberated parts of China, so we occupied parts of China. So you see how we divided up the world based on who we liberated. These divisions on the areas that we liberated actually set down the lines for what is going to become the Cold War. So you're going to have the Soviet Union, which is going to be considered the second world power. As you saw in your book, it talks about the first world being the United States and its allies, the second world being the Soviet Union and its allies, basically the people it liberated following World War II, and America's allies were the people we liberated following World War II, including France and Western Germany. United States and Soviet Union are going to go head to head after 1945, trying to get more and more countries to align with them, to extend their power over other countries politically, and fight an ideological war we call the Cold War. So these are some of the long-term after effects of World War II. The world was devastated by World War II. Some positive things came out of it, like the United Nations, but some negative things came out of it as well, like the Cold War. That's it for my lecture for today. Thank you for putting up with all of my technological problems, and again, email me or let me know if you have any questions at all about what I talked about today.